On that fateful day at Golgotha, one soldier stood closer to Jesus than anyone else, not in worship, but in violence. His name has been lost to history, yet his act echoes through eternity. This man was the one who lifted the hammer, who drove the nails, who sealed the moment that split time itself. But what if his story did not end on that hill? What if his soul carried a terrifying curse that no battlefield could prepare him for? Whispers from early traditions suggest his life unraveled into madness, torment, and visions no man could escape. The same hands that struck the cross became haunted by the weight of what they touched. Was it divine punishment? Was it the justice of heaven? Or the natural consequence of crossing paths with the Son of God in such a brutal way? The deeper we dig, the more horrifying and revealing this tale becomes. If you feel the chill of this moment reaching into your spirit, I invite you to comment 777 below. Treat it not as numbers, but as a mark of alignment, a sacred declaration that you walk with truth rather than deny it. And to every one of you who has stood by this channel, whether by sharing, subscribing, or giving through super thanks, I honor you deeply. Your presence keeps these stories alive. Now, let us turn to the shadows of Calvary, where history, mystery, and divine judgment intertwine. What became of the soldier who crucified Jesus? Stay with me, because the answer is more terrifying and more meaningful than you've ever imagined. The terrifying curse of the soldier who crucified Jesus on the cross. On that Friday in Jerusalem, the air itself felt heavy, as though the heavens knew what was about to unfold. Dark clouds gathered above Golgotha, shrouding the hill in an unsettling gloom. 3 crosses stood like grim sentinels, and at their base a Roman centurion carried out what, for him, was routine duty. Crucifixion was nothing new to a soldier of Rome, yet this time it was different. The man before him was Jesus of Nazareth, accused and condemned, yet strangely unlike any other. His assignment was clear: ensure that this Jesus died. Cold obedience drove his actions, and he fulfilled his orders with precision. But as the hours passed, something began to disturb his hardened heart. When the 6th hour struck, the world seemed to protest. Darkness covered the land, stretching on until the 9th hour, as though creation itself mourned. And then came that cry, piercing the suffocating silence: my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34. The voice was not one of defeat, but of profound mystery, echoing across time with one final shout. Jesus released his spirit, and the earth responded in violent agreement. The temple veil tore from top to bottom, a sign no human hands could orchestrate. What did it mean that the barrier between God and humanity was ripped open in that exact moment? Could even the most powerful empire control such a sign? The centurion, who only moments earlier was just another enforcer of Rome's iron will, found himself trembling as he gazed upon the lifeless body on the cross. The words burst from his lips without hesitation: truly, this man was the Son of God. That confession was not born of duty, but of revelation. In the space of a heartbeat, he had shifted from executioner to witness, from carrying out orders to testifying of divinity. Have you ever faced a moment where the truth struck so forcefully that it shattered everything you thought you knew? This soldier's life would never be the same. Once he had pierced Jesus' side to confirm his death. Now he bore the mark of being the first Gentile to proclaim faith in him. What does it mean that the empire's own instrument of power became the mouth through which faith was declared? He abandoned rank, privilege, and the security of Rome's legions. Instead, he chose the uncertain path of following the crucified Messiah. He traveled into distant lands, carrying not a spear but a message, telling of the man he had executed, and yet the man who changed him forever. Church tradition would later remember his name as Longinus, and though his story ended in tragedy, his testimony became immortal. Do you sense the irony? The one sent to break a body was himself broken open, and from that breaking came belief. How far would you go if the truth confronted you with such undeniable power? Before the darkness of that fateful Friday fell upon Jerusalem, Longinus was not yet remembered as a name whispered in church tradition. He was a Roman centurion, hardened by years of service, a commander of more than 100 men. Centurions were the backbone of the empire's military machine. Men respected not only for their courage in combat, but for their ability to enforce discipline with an iron will. To reach that rank required more than brute strength. It demanded a sharp mind, a calculating spirit, and above all, the ability to carry out orders without hesitation, no matter how cruel. Longinus embodied all of it. Violence had become second nature, duty his creed, and Rome his only master. He had stared death in the face countless times and never blinked. To him, life was order, strategy, and ruthless obedience. He was not a man, he was an instrument of empire. But Jerusalem was restless, and whispers filled the streets long before dawn. Footsteps scurried across stone alleys, voices hushed yet urgent, and one name spread like fire through the shadows: Jesus of Nazareth. The city had not yet fully awakened, but the drama had already begun to unfold. The night before, in the quiet of Gethsemane's garden, soldiers had come with torches and chains. They arrested the one who claimed to be the Son of God, betrayed by the sting of a kiss from his own disciple. Judas Iscariot had traded loyalty for silver 30 pieces, the price of a slave. Dragged before the Sanhedrin, the council of priests and elders, Jesus faced accusations of blasphemy. They struck him, mocked him, spat on him, and condemned him with their verdict. Yet for all their fury, they lacked the authority to end his life. Only Rome could wield that kind of power, and so the council turned their prisoner over to the empire. Pilate would have to decide, and soldiers like Longinus would be the ones to carry it out. At the break of dawn, the prisoner was brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who held in his hands the authority of life and death. The governor, seated upon the judgment seat, regarded the man standing before him with curious eyes. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked, testing both the man and the charge laid against him. Jesus answered with a calm that disarmed the air, "You have said so." The chief priests and elders seized the moment, hurling accusation upon accusation, hoping to crush him with their words. Yet he stood silent. No defense, nor justification, not even a whisper of protest. Pilate leaned closer, half bewildered and half intrigued. "Do you not hear what they testify against you? Will you not speak to save yourself?" Still, Jesus spoke nothing. This silence thundered louder than any plea, for Pilate had witnessed countless criminals beg, bargain, and cry to escape their fate. But this man radiated a peace that unsettled him. Suddenly, a messenger pushed through the tribunal's crowd. delivering an urgent message. It was from Pilate's wife. "Have nothing to do with this innocent man. For today I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." Matthew 27-19. Pilate shifted uneasily in his seat, troubled not only by the calmness of the accused, but by the warning from his own household. What greater force was weaving this moment? Could destiny itself be pressing against the edges of his authority, reminding him that he was but a pawn in a divine drama? As governor, he sought a way of escape. The festival of Passover gave him an opportunity. One prisoner could be released to the people. He presented the choice: Jesus of Nazareth or Barabbas, a notorious murderer whose name was stained with blood. Logic should have favored Jesus. Yet the priests and elders moved among the crowd like fire, stirring them to roar. "Release Barabbas." Pilate's chance for justice slipped away in the noise of manipulation. He tried again, raising his voice above the uproar. "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" The answer came as a violent chorus: "Crucify him." His heart raced. And still he pressed once more. Why? What evil has he done? But the crowd only grew louder, more savage, their fury unrelenting. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" It was the cry of chaos drowning the whisper of truth. Pilate, seeing the storm beyond his control, grasped for a gesture that would absolve him. A basin of water was brought, and before the multitude he washed his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It is your responsibility." As could fall minter, yet could water wash away guilt when blood about to be shed was innocent? Pilate released Barabbas, and with that, handed Jesus over to be crucified. In that moment, the Son of God's earthly fate was sealed, not by justice, but by the will of men overcome with rage. What does it mean when a ruler, endowed with power, chooses safety over truth? The soldiers dragged Jesus into the praetorium, their laughter echoing off the cold stone walls. At the entrance, the centurion Longinus stood as he always had, an unshakable sentinel, hardened by duty, his arms folded across a chest that had witnessed countless scenes of cruelty. He had overseen floggings, executions, and deaths that blurred together into a single rhythm of violence. Yet on this morning, something was different. The prisoner offered no resistance. No curses filled the air. No desperate cries for mercy broke the silence. He accepted each blow as though it were not merely unavoidable, but somehow necessary, as if every lash of the whip carried a purpose beyond pain. The soldiers, finding entertainment in their own cruelty, stripped him of his garments and bound him tightly to a pillar. The scourge bit into his flesh again and again, tearing skin without restraint. Still, not a single cry escaped his lips. Longinus watched with the eyes of a man who thought he had seen it all, yet found himself strangely unsettled. In the face of agony, this condemned man remained calm. Could anyone endure such suffering without hatred boiling inside them? The soldiers escalated their mockery, draping a purple robe across his wounded shoulders. They twisted thorny branches into a crown and pressed it deep into his brow. Blood mingled with sweat, dripping down his face, but his eyes remained unflinching, steady, calm, unwavering. They thrust a stick into his hand like a parody of a scepter, knelt before him with exaggerated gestures, and jeered, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Their laughter rang cruelly through the chamber. Longinus, however, did not laugh. He had no taste for this performance. Instead, unease crept into his chest. It was not the violence he was accustomed to but the dignity radiating from this battered man. Spittle struck his face. Fists slammed against the crown of thorns. The mockery intensified. At last, weary of their game, the soldiers stripped off the robe, clothed him again, and made ready for the long walk to Golgotha. Yet Longinus could not turn his eyes away. Something hidden deep within him, long dormant beneath years of brutality, began to stir. Why did this prisoner remain silent? Why did his gaze, though bloodied, shine with compassion rather than rage? Others saw only a condemned man. Longinus began to sense something far greater. Questions he had never allowed himself to ask pressed at his mind. Who truly is this man? Why does he bear torment with such unearthly grace? The centurion did not yet know the answer. But before the sun would set, he would stand face to face with a revelation that would shatter his old self. On that day, Longinus would witness not just another crucifixion, but the greatest act of love the world would ever know, and from that moment onward, nothing in his life would ever remain the same. The soldiers seized Jesus and forced him out of the praetorium, thrusting upon his shoulders a massive wooden cross. Its rough beams were scarred with the weight of countless condemned men before him, soaked in the memory of suffering. Now it became his burden. The march toward Golgotha, the Hill of Skulls, had begun. At the head of the procession strode Longinus, the centurion, his armor catching the dim light as he cleared the way. This was his duty, to lead the prisoner through the jeering crowd to the place of death. Golgotha was where Rome sent the unwanted to vanish in disgrace, where the empire's cruelty was carved into the very earth. The road filled with noise and fury. Some in the crowd spat upon Jesus, their voices sharp with insult and mockery. Others hurled curses as though his pain were entertainment. Yet not all joined in. Here and there, silent faces streaked with tears watched helplessly, unable to reconcile his innocence with the punishment he bore. The scene was a collision of hate and grief, and in its midst walked the Son of God, silent beneath the weight of the cross. Among the crowd was Mary, his mother, her eyes frantic, searching desperately for her son. Her heart was pierced in ways that echoed Simeon's prophecy from decades earlier. A sword will pierce your own soul too, Luke 2:35. Unable to reach him through the sea of bodies, she turned to the disciple John at her side. "John, help me. Take me to my son." Together, they pressed forward, pushing against the tide of voices and soldiers. But then came the moment that seared itself into every witness's memory. A soldier shoved Jesus violently, and his weakened body crumpled onto the unforgiving stones. The cross crashed down upon him, its weight crushing his back. The soldiers barked at him with fury, striking him, shouting, "Get up!" with staggering effort. Jesus pressed against the ground, forcing his battered frame to rise. His movements were slow, labored, yet resolute. Mary and John reached him just as his body gave way again. He collapsed under the beam for the second time, the stones now stained with both blood and sweat. Mary could not restrain herself any longer. She rushed to him, falling to her knees beside her broken son. Her hands shook violently as she touched him, her eyes wide with unspeakable sorrow. "I am here," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crowd. And then, through torn lips and a face marred with blood, Jesus lifted his gaze. His eyes found hers, not with despair, but with a strange, unshakable strength. His words came softly, yet they rang with eternity. You see, Mother, I make all things new. It was not a simple attempt to comfort her, it was a declaration. A prophecy alive, even in his agony. In those words was the promise that suffering would not be the end. That from the weight of the cross would come renewal for all creation. What must it have felt like for Mary, holding her dying son, to hear a phrase that spoke not of death, but of transformation? And for those watching, could they fathom that in this brutal march, history itself was being remade? The weight of the cross pressed deeper into torn flesh, each step more agonizing than the last. His strength faltered, and again he collapsed upon the stones. The soldiers, impatient and merciless, lashed at him with their whips, demanding he rise. But his body refused. His knees buckled, trembling beneath the crushing load. To those watching, it looked like defeat. But to Longinus, who had witnessed countless men broken on this same path, something was different. This man was not crushed in spirit. His body fell, but there was a resolve in him that could not be beaten down. Seeing the prisoner unable to continue, Longinus scanned the crowd, his sharp eyes fixed on a man returning from the countryside. He seized him with authority. You there, take up his cross. The man's name was Simon of Cyrene, and though reluctant, he bent to lift the weight. Jesus, weary yet conscious, lifted his face toward the stranger. Their eyes met, and in that single exchange was a silent gift of gratitude. The burden was shared, and the march pressed on. The city witnessed it all. The death procession wound through narrow streets, drawing spectators from every corner. Some jeered and mocked, but many, especially the women, lifted their voices in grief, weeping openly for the condemned. Jesus turned to them, even as blood streaked his face, and with words that pierced through centuries, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Luke 23:28. In his pain, he spoke not of his own suffering, but of the judgment and sorrow to come. Longinus heard it, and once more something within him stirred. An ache not born of violence but of truth. What kind of man, staggering toward death, still carried the weight of others' futures in his words? Could this prisoner be more than what Rome claimed him to be? At last they reached Golgotha, the hill of skulls, dry, barren, and cursed with death. It waited like a gaping wound in the earth. 3 crosses were laid ready. The soldiers began their grim work. Jesus offered no resistance. He did not curse their names or fight their hands. Instead, he stretched out his arms as though offering himself freely. A sacrifice given, not stolen. One soldier gripped his arm to the wood. Another raised the hammer high. The air split with the sound of metal driving through flesh. The cry that followed rose into the heavens. Carried by agony but wrapped in surrender, Mary trembled, her heart collapsing with every strike. John turned his face, unable to watch. The crowd buzzed in whispers and gasps. Some sobbed, while others still mocked. And Longinus, he stood fixed in silence, watching, unable to move. When the nails secured him, they fastened 2 more men beside him, criminals, one on the right and one on the left. Together, the soldiers heaved the crosses upright. With a brutal thud, the wood sank into the earth, jarring the body of Jesus. His frame shook violently from the impact. Yet, even then, his face bore not hatred, but something deeper. Could it be compassion? Could it be love? In that moment, Golgotha became the stage where heaven and earth would collide. And Longinus, the soldier who thought himself unshaken, began to feel the ground shift beneath his soul. The cries of the condemned echoed across Golgotha. The two criminals nailed beside Jesus writhed in pain, their voices rising above the murmuring crowd. One of them, bitterness twisted into his face, turned his fury upon the man at the center. "Aren't you the Christ? If you are who they say you are, then save yourself and save us too." His words dripped with scorn, mocking not just the man but the claim of kingship that had followed him all the way to this place of death. But the other criminal, broken and gasping, found enough strength to speak with a trembling yet resolute voice. He rebuked his companion. "Do you not fear God? We are under the same sentence. But we are here justly. We are receiving what our deeds deserve. This man has done nothing wrong." The crowd hushed as his words fell, striking deeper than the insults that had filled the air. And then, with eyes filled, not with anger, but with a desperate hope, he turned toward Jesus. His request was simple yet eternal. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." The response came not with thunder, but with a tenderness that shattered despair. "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Luke 23:43. A condemned man, moments from death, received the promise of life everlasting. The cross, meant as Rome's instrument of shame, became instead the doorway into eternity. Longinus stood nearby, his post unchanged, but his heart stirred in ways he had never known. He had presided over executions without number, but never had he witnessed such authority spoken through weakness, such mercy poured out in agony. His soldier's instincts told him this was no ordinary man. Time itself seemed to halt, as though creation were holding its breath. The sun dimmed, and darkness veiled the land, though it was the middle of the day. The centurion's eyes, trained to observe, remained fixed on the figure in the center. And then came words no executioner had ever heard. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. Forgiveness, not curses, not pleas for rescue, not bitterness, but mercy for his tormentors. How could such words be uttered from a cross? How could love endure when nails and mockery had already done their work? A sudden shiver coursed through Longinus's chest, a tremor deeper than fear, something like awakening. Forgiveness. Forgiveness for the soldiers who scourged his back, for the men who drove the nails, for those who mocked without mercy, and even for him. Could such grace truly stretch that far? Thunder rumbled low in the distance, a storm gathering as if heaven itself prepared to respond. Caiaphas and the other priests, satisfied that their deed was complete, and withdrew from the scene. But Mary remained rooted at the foot of the cross, her grief unbearable. John stayed by her side, his arm gently supporting her as she watched the life drain from her son. In a voice weak yet steady, Jesus broke the silence. Looking to his mother, he spoke, "Woman, behold your son." Then his gaze turned to John. "Behold your mother." John 19:26-27. Even in agony, he knit them together in love, creating family out of faith. His body trembled, his breath labored, and then, with a cry that pierced the heavens, he called out, my God, Why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34. The cry carried both pain and mystery, echoing the Psalms of David. Words of prophecy fulfilled in anguish. Those nearby misunderstood. Some thought he called for Elijah, believing perhaps that the prophet would come in fire to deliver him. One rushed forward, dipping a sponge in sour wine, lifting it on a reed to his lips. But Jesus turned away. He would not dull the suffering. His sacrifice had to be whole, unbroken, carried to its end. And so the hill grew still. A solemn hush settled over the crowd, as if even mockery had lost its power. Jesus then lifted his gaze toward the unseen heavens. He knew the moment had come. Drawing upon the last reserves of his strength, he cried out in triumph, "It is finished." John 19:30. The words rang not of defeat, but of victory, the completion of a mission no one else could bear. And finally, with eyes lifted one last time, he whispered, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke 23:46. With that, he bowed his head. Breath left his body. The Son of God had died. Longinus stood witness, his heart shaken to its core. Could this truly be the end? Or was it, as the earth itself seemed to suggest, the beginning of something that would never die? Then the earth itself broke its silence. At the very moment Jesus breathed his last, the ground convulsed beneath their feet. A violent quake swept across Jerusalem, shaking walls, splitting rocks, and breaking open tombs. Within the temple, unseen to those at Golgotha, but later told with trembling voices, the veil that separated the Holy of Holies was torn in two from top to bottom, as though the hand of God himself had ripped apart the barrier between heaven and earth. The mocking voices fell away. Terror etched itself across the faces of the crowd. Many struck their chests in grief, realizing too late the weight of their actions. Amidst the chaos, the unthinkable happened. Longinus, the hardened centurion, dropped to his knees. His armor clattered as his body trembled, and words escaped his lips, unbidden. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Mark 15:39. The executioner became a witness, the first Gentile to proclaim the crucified Christ for who he truly was. Golgotha grew still beneath that confession, silence draping itself like a shroud over the hill of skulls. The lifeless body of Jesus hung upon the cross. The soldiers, unsettled by the quake and by whispers of dread, began to pull back. The crowd scattered, confusion and fear rising like dust in the air. Yet the day pressed forward. It was the day of preparation for the Passover, and Jewish custom demanded no body remain upon the crosses when the Sabbath arrived. The leaders petitioned Pilate, and an order was given. The condemned should be killed swiftly by breaking their legs. That command came down the chain to Longinus. He relayed the order, and soldiers carried it out with brutal efficiency. They seized heavy iron bars, striking the legs of the two criminals. Bones splintered, cries erupted, and the end came quickly for them. But when they turned toward Jesus, Longinus stopped them. He knew. His eyes had watched the moment when life left him. The breath was gone, the body still. Yet Roman law required certainty. Taking up his own spear, Longinus approached the cross. With a single thrust, he pierced the side of the crucified one, and in that instant, something miraculous happened. Blood and water flowed forth. John 19:34. for those who saw it. It was more than proof of death. It was a sign, mysterious and sacred, as if even in dying, Jesus poured himself out fully, to the last drop. The evangelist John, who stood close enough to see everything, would later record with gravity, "He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true." John 19:35. Longinus stared at the open wound and then down at his own spear, its tip stained with that untainted flow. In that instant, prophecy had quietly unfolded before his very eyes. "They shall look on him whom they pierced." Zechariah 12:10. The blood spoke of redemption, the water of purification together. A living symbol pouring out from the crucified one. Drops fell upon Longinus's face. Tradition whispers that his eyes, long afflicted by a haze that dimmed his vision, were suddenly cleared. The sacred mixture touched him, and his sight was restored, not only the sight of his eyes, but of his soul. For the first time, he truly saw, right there at the foot of the cross, beneath the torn heavens and trembling earth. Longinus understood he had not executed a criminal. He had pierced the body of the Son of God. His knees gave way again, not from duty, but from reverence. This time, he fell not as a soldier, but as a believer. What followed, Scripture leaves unspoken, as if heaven itself veiled the details. But church tradition and ancient accounts fill in the silence. Longinus, torn by what he had witnessed, could not simply return to the rhythms of camp life, could not clean his spear and stand watch as if nothing had happened. Sleep abandoned him. In every quiet moment, the image of the crucified Christ returned his stillness, his words of forgiveness, his final surrender. It burned in Longinus's mind like a flame that refused to go out. Each order barked at him now carried a question. Was he obeying truth or serving a blind empire that crushed the innocent beneath its heel? The man who once found clarity in obedience now found only torment in silence. The cross had broken through his armor, and every heartbeat whispered the same truth. He had stood at the center of history, and nothing in his life could ever be the same. After the crucifixion, the city did not quiet as Rome expected. Instead, whispers spread like wildfire through Jerusalem. Some said the stone at the tomb had been rolled away. Others claimed they had seen him alive, the very man Longinus himself had watched breathe his last upon the cross. The centurion listened in silence, his soldier's face unmoved. Yet every word pierced him deeper than any blade. He could not dismiss it. Something within him, born from that day at Golgotha, confirmed what the rumors proclaimed. Death had not been the end. Night after night, he found no rest. Sleep fled from him, chased away by visions of the crucifixion. The cross haunted him not as horror, but as a sacred fire burning in memory. He remembered every moment the way Jesus spoke forgiveness, the calm in his eyes, the prophecy spoken to the weeping women, the final cry that shook the heavens, the scenes replayed with relentless clarity, echoing louder than the orders of Rome ever had. Meanwhile, life in Jerusalem returned to its rhythm. Markets reopened. Voices filled the streets. The empire moved on, but Longinus could not. The man who once lived by iron discipline and bloodshed now felt his heart bending, cracking like stone under strain. He was no longer the ruthless centurion Rome had forged. Something within him was breaking free, and when he heard that some disciples swore they had touched him, spoken with him, even eaten with him after death. Longinus felt no surprise. Where others doubted, he did not. Where others questioned, he felt only a deep, unshakable certainty. It was not rumor. It was not madness. It was truth. Yes, Jesus had overcome death. For a man who had spent his life under the shadow of empire, this realization was like standing beneath a greater throne, one no Roman legion could ever topple. And with that certainty, Longinus's journey had only just begun. For the first time in his life, Longinus began to grasp what faith truly meant. The cross, which he once regarded as a tool of execution, now became to him the very emblem of salvation, the forgiveness he had witnessed, the redemption that flowed with blood and water. No longer seemed like words from another world. They were alive within him. The centurion understood at last, and with that clarity, he could no longer serve two masters. He laid down his commission, removed his armor, returned his sword, and walked away from the empire he had obeyed all his life. Without hesitation, he stepped onto a new path, a journey of faith that would carry him far beyond the borders of Rome. He sought the company of those who had known Jesus, the disciples who had walked at his side, eaten at his table, and listened to his words. Longinus, once feared as a commander of soldiers, now sat humbly at the feet of fishermen and tax collectors, learning from men he once might have dismissed as ordinary. But they were not ordinary. They were witnesses of resurrection. And now, so was he. Among the early believers, his name began to spread. Longinus, the Roman centurion who once raised a spear against the Son of God, now walked barefoot with a heart burning to proclaim that same Son as King. For years he traveled across the provinces, reaching as far as Cappadocia and Caesarea in what is now Turkey. In every village, every gathering, his testimony carried weight. No argument could silence. I watched him he would declare with conviction. Yet in his death, I found life. His words shook listeners because they were not second-hand tales. They were born of blood, of sight, of his own trembling hands at the cross. The same hand that once wielded Rome's sword now lifted the banner of the gospel with courage. Wherever Longinus preached, hearts turned, not because he spoke with the polish of philosophers, but because he spoke as a man transformed. He was not just any preacher. He was the centurion who had stood at the very foot of the cross. And that truth carried a power greater than legions. But Rome was not a master easily abandoned. The empire that once honored Longinus as a centurion soon marked him as a traitor. Word spread of his new allegiance not to Caesar, but to Christ, and persecution followed swiftly. Arrested and dragged before magistrates, he endured interrogation, beatings, and threats of death. They dangled freedom before him, offering life if only he would renounce the name of Jesus. Yet Longinus, with the calm of a man who had touched truth itself, refused. His voice carried no anger, only conviction. Rome had trained him to face death with discipline. Christ had taught him to face it with peace. And so the verdict was sealed execution. The empire that had once clothed him in armor would now strip him of life. They led him outside the city to a barren hill, the wind carrying silence over the crowd that gathered. There, with eyes lifted to the heavens, Longinus met his fate. The blade fell, and he died not as a soldier of Rome, but as a martyr of Christ. His final gaze mirrored the crucified one he had once watched breathe out. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. His body was laid to rest in Cappadocia, and believers soon came to his tomb. Stories spread of healings, of prayers answered, of miracles that flowed from the ground where he was buried. The name Longinus was no longer tied to an executioner's spear, but to a witness's faith, a martyr's crown. Through the centuries, the Church remembered him, honoring him as Saint Longinus, the soldier who saw, the soldier who believed, the soldier who died for the one who first died for him. His story stood as a living paradox. Rome had sought to silence him, yet his testimony only grew louder with time. But Longinus was not alone. He joined a company far greater, the apostles themselves: Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Thaddeus, and James, the son of Alphaeus. From Jerusalem's crowded streets to distant lands, these 12 carried a message sharper than any sword, mightier than any legion. They toppled idols, challenged kings, and split history into before and after. They held no weapons, commanded no armies, secured no political alliances. Their only power was faith in what they had seen and the boldness to testify. And that, more than any empire, reshaped the world forever. The story of Longinus does not end with the clash of steel or the roar of Rome. It ends with faith that outlived an empire. The man who once pierced the side of Christ became, in the end, a living testimony that grace can break even the hardest heart. His life teaches us that no one is beyond redemption, that even those who once stood as enemies of truth can become its loudest witnesses. To me, that is what makes his story so powerful. It reminds us that the cross is not just an event sealed in history, but a call that still echoes through our own lives. In a world where power is often measured by control, wealth, or influence, Longinus shows us another way: the courage to lay everything down for what is eternal. He left the empire of Rome, but he gained the kingdom of God. And maybe that is the same choice we are faced with today: to keep serving the noise of this world, or to walk, like Longinus, into a life reshaped by faith, compassion, and conviction. If his testimony could shake centuries, what could your life say if you dared to live with the same boldness? His eyes were opened at the foot of the cross. Our eyes, too, can be opened in the places we least expect, if we are willing to see. So let his story stir something in you. Carry it beyond this moment. And as we continue to share these journeys of faith together, I invite you like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss what's next. And drop a comment below about what part of Longinus's story struck you the deepest. Thank you for standing with us, whether through your super thanks or simply through your presence here. May this story remind you that even in the darkest hours, light still breaks through. And may you walk forward with the same faith that turned a Roman soldier into a saint.